Hello and welcome to the Small Talk series brought to you by the Bagri Foundation. Today we'll be discussing different ways of approaching the world, intangible and tangible realities, or whether there's a hidden dimension. Max Carocci, one of our speakers, is an academic specialising in Indigenous Native American art and museum studies, while our other speaker, Jessica Frazier, is an Oxford and Cambridge educated academic focusing on Sanskrit, religion and philosophy. She's the author of numerous works and a regular BBC broadcaster. To delve into intangible realities, let's welcome Jessica Frazier and Max Carocci.
As someone who's always been interested in the way that cultures dig deeper into what they see as hidden levels of reality, or express ideas of another world behind this one, or other levels of the real. I'm really interested in the way in which, in your case, what you've seen of Native American cultures, how these other levels or hidden realities get expressed, if you find them there.
Totally. What is interesting about Native North American expressions, and I want to frame the whole conversation within the area that I'm mostly familiar with, which is art and material culture, the production of what we call art, is that art and material culture very often are a way into these other realities, these other registers of reality, we could call them. This is something that is not immediately apparent to an outside viewer, because as we learn about Native American history and art, what we see is just beautiful objects that we think are just decorative. However, what these objects are underpinned by is this very sense of the transcendent, because many of the decorations that you see on these objects are entirely derived from either visions or dreams or mystical encounters. And that in itself is almost constitutes a portal into these other registers of reality, is a way in which is a way of connecting these two levels, the tangible world and something that is invisible. But the interesting point, I think, with North American cultures is that there is a line of continuity between the tangible reality and the intangible reality. And what counts as real, essentially, is also what appears in dreams. Mm-hmm. So whereas in our Western perspective, very often we see dreams as something that is unreal, in Native North American cultures, what appears in dreams is as real as the tangible reality. Mm-hmm. And so many of the themes and many of the motifs and many of the inspirations that come to artists to make certain objects or decorate them in a particular way come in this way. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I think that art, in the case, or just for lack of a better term, that produced by Native North Americans is, in a sense, in so many ways, a portal into this, or an opening towards these other registers.
Out of interest, you say portal, and are these cases where people are depicting the other world, in which case you have a pictorial image, etc., art in the kind of representative sense that most people know in the West, a picture of something? Or are they actually meant to be more? Are they meant in some sense to actually give you access to that world?
Yes. This is a very interesting distinction that you're making, and I think is appropriate for us to distinguish between these two modes of representation, because they do exist side by side. Yeah. In fact, what I can see is that historically, more and more, the representational sort of narrative sort of mode takes over the other mode. If before representational art, or what we understand as representational art, could be a way to manifest the intangible, manifest the transcendent. There is a sense whereby in the latter part of the 19th century, with the arrival of Europeans and a significant impact of the visual cultures brought by Europeans, there is a sense whereby representations become representations. That is, literal representations of what people see, which is something that it didn't happen before.
Yeah.
It wasn't done. It was a different way of seeing. Most significantly because sight was probably not quite as important.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? This idea that the whole of contemporary Western culture, and in its becoming global, more and more world culture, wants to see, wants evidence through the eyes, and that's the way we get reality.
Exactly.
And it's not how many cultures actually saw. It's not how they sensed the world. Through the feeling, through the body, through scent, even mood. I think you see contexts in India where mood is something that you're feeling and living through that sort of sense of things. So it's a fascinating contrast with two different worlds.
Yeah, before I started studying along these lines, I must say that quite a lot of inspiration and certainly quite a lot of insight came from study of Indian arts, precisely because learning about the transcendent and the immanent in Indian art, that gave me a very good point of reference to start or guidance into thinking the ways in which Native Americans were doing things, and the very notion of what counts as real was almost enlightening. Precisely because I came across material that very likely you're more familiar than I am.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, India is wonderful because it's so complex as a culture. It has such a rich literary and philosophical level that goes back such a long time, 500, 1000 BCE. And then it also has the lived levels, and it has alchemy traditions, and it has magical shamanic traditions, and it has just incredible complexity. But you see them coming together in interesting ways. I was just reading the Upanishads, which are about 500 BCE, very early classical texts, from a culture that was just starting to understand the world around it. And you see this theme throughout all of these short pieces, which is how can we get from the unreal world to the real world? And an assumption that what we're seeing is not necessarily the real, it's behind, it's further. So that you get some Upanishads that focus on the body and say this is not the real body. Because look, it keeps changing. Something else inside of it is the real body. And they talk about the breath as this hidden part, or they talk about the energy, or the way food disappears into the body but makes it work, what's happening. So you get that level, but you also get the philosophical level where they're going, in the Chandogya Upanishads, one of my favorites, you get a father and a son chatting, and the father says, look, you see this, but underneath, it looks like a glass of water, but underneath it's made of something else, crystal, and this is what it really is. They're looking at everything in search of that hidden world, and I find that impulse really fascinating.
Yes, and I want to pick up on something that you just said, because it is precisely coming across the Indian context and the study of Indian arts that actually gave me a lot of food for thought, so to speak, in this very notion of vision and the darshan and being seen, the importance of vision in that sense, which actually is almost entirely the opposite in the case of the cultures I am familiar with. The very notion of seeing is actually very deceiving, in so much as perhaps in a way that is akin to what you're describing, reality, this tangible reality is almost an illusion. And so whatever the eyes meet is not the real thing, or at least it suggests that there may be an alternative to what you see. So you're never sure who you're going to meet. It could be a person transformed. It could be a spirit, in human form. It could be any number of different possibilities. Therefore, even in the representation of the human, the visual representation or the three-dimensional representations of the human, you have at least in the at the very beginnings, and when we're talking about before 1830s, before the big impact of Euro-American culture, at least in the cultures that I look at, has a dent in the culture, you see there is no need to represent reality the way the eyes meet it.
Mm-hmm.
So even the narrative style, which is used to depict biographical episodes of someone's life or events that might have happened, are very sketchy.
Yeah.
They focus on the action and the gesture. They do not focus so much on the physical feature of the person. And this is quite telling, because it's not that Native North Americans couldn't possibly or technically reproduce reality the way the eyes see it. It's just that their culture didn't encourage the development of technologies that made that possible.
Yeah.
And so what does that say about reality is the fact that the action and the gesture and the dynamism of the cosmos, essentially, is much more relevant to them than the actual features.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and it is through meeting the darshan that actually I started thinking through this.
Yeah.
So it was quite enlightening for me to have that.
It's a wonderful. This is what I
imprint.
love. Yeah, it's fascinating. This is what I love about studying different cultures and different cultures within a single culture. There's so many different perspectives, but you see more as a scholar. So suddenly, when I look at you, from that perspective, then I look at gesture, I look at embodiment, I look at expression. And then you jump to India and you're getting a slightly different register. So I think they're also thinking that the visual body is not that important because it could all kinds of things. As you say, I think many cultures believe all kinds of things could be going on in that body. You could be a god who's taken human form, right? You, in any case, even if you're a person, just a human, this is one of many bodies. Is this the important body,
course.
right? In next life, you might have a different body.
Oh, of course.
And I think there's an awareness, the early texts, Sankhya texts and Ayurvedic texts of sort of Indian philosophy and medicine, were very aware of the way bodies change. They're made of different elements. The biological body isn't that important in a weird way. So and of course, something that only recently has become a major theme in the study of India is how important possession traditions are. A couple of scholars called Frederick Smith and David Gordon White have done a lot of work to say, look, India and actually much of South and Southeast Asia believe in possession. Anybody could be inside this body. Might not be Jessica Frazier. So I think there's often a mistrust of the visual, which really contrasts with the contemporary Western material, both visual and material idea of what the human is.
Yes.
But maybe with the contrast with the Native American examples, in India, then it's not the face or the body, but the eyes, right? That's where you see what's going on. And that comes out in the statues, for instance. So if you look at devotional images, murtis, of the gods, you look in their eyes.
Yes.
The face doesn't matter. But in here, something is alive. That's the real behind the real for the human being. Does gaze and eyesight count in the...
Not at all. Not
It's
at all.
terrible. That's how we
Not
see
at all.
each other.
I mean, it's not that it's not important. I wouldn't say that it's not important, but it is certainly, it doesn't stem from the same philosophical tradition that we have, whereby the eyes are the windows into the soul, for example. That notion is completely unknown. In order to know someone, for Native North Americans, in a great part of North America, and most part of North America, is by having the person around. Being able to appreciate how they carry themselves about, how their modality of interaction with things, with animals, with plants, with other beings. This is what actually says something about the person. This is why I mention gesture and action as more important than actually vision, because vision can be deceiving. And so looking into the eyes can be is always an ambivalent action. It's not quite so firmly telling you this is what is happening, this is what is going on. In fact, in some cultures in North America, people don't look at you at all. It is considered rude. It is considered rude precisely maybe because you can detect something else from behind it. I don't know, but it's not considered an appropriate thing to do, which is contrary to what we do, which is look at each other in the eyes in order to make a connection. But the kind of connection that Native Americans make between each other or among each other is rather different. I was reading quite recently a piece by Walter Ong, who very famous for writing on oral cultures and writing and the technology of writing. And what he was saying was really quite interesting about the ways in which we talk about a worldview as opposed to a world as event, which he associates with people with oral traditions. Therefore, I think it is a very fitting description of what I find in Native North American cultures happens, which is not relying entirely on sight, but rather on all the other senses. And these are senses that perhaps could even, may I suggest, include extrasensory senses, that is, intuition or God knows what else. And so it is interesting that he's picking up on this idea of the world view and suggesting something that is perhaps more appropriate with regards to cultures that do not have the same kind of scopophilia, we call it, that we, this desire or obsession with the seeing, with the visual.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It immediately makes me think, okay, so in the West, and also I think to a large extent in the Indian case, the eyes are so central in terms of a form of authenticity. That's how you really know. And there's a whole thing about nazar and love stories. The Persian phrase means the glance, and it's in that glance that the love is transmitted. But also in some older texts, the Kama, the god of love, enters through your eyes.
I see.
And possession happens through the eyes. Subjectivities, be it your minds, are meeting through the eyes. And I wonder, and I think, okay, well, yeah, of course that makes sense, because you look into someone's eyes, you see them, you understand, you can't lie. But actually, of course, that's not true. And to see how someone behaves is probably a much better index of truthfulness, of what a person really is. So it's a very pragmatic, culturally, actually, psychologically, perhaps wise perspective.
Possibly. Possibly.
I wonder what that means in terms of communities coming together, if you're trying to get to know strangers, for instance. Like, I think a lot of these things come out of what it means to have a functioning communal group. And in this case, they seem to understand something about embodied living with as the way to judge who's a friend.
Yes, entirely. There is always a sense of what we could describe as, if not skepticism, certainly a certain ambivalence, rather. Ambivalence towards strangers, because you never know. You can never be sure. Give them time, and then they will reveal themselves for who they are. They will reveal themselves through their actions, to what they do.
And that's actually a very wise way to do it. But it's interesting, I wonder what the Indian case, it makes me realize that the reason they value the eyes, the vision, the gaze, is because there's an underlying philosophy of what is behind the eyes, which is consciousness, and an assumption that consciousness is shared, is more or less the same across different people.
Yes.
There's consciousness is something we all have, and it unifies us. So that in a sense it's that underlying concept of the self and the real. There's another Upanishad, the Kena Upanishad, which means by what. Kena in Sanskrit is by what. And the Upanishad says, by what do I see? By what do I hear? By whom who is it who sends forth this thought? That is the person that I really am. So that the assumption is when you look into that eyesight, you're looking into another mind who's the fundamental person, and also realizing that that's the same as what's in you. So there's a kind of all of this is grounded in a view of reality where humans are basically already the same and connected. But I'm guessing maybe that's a very different ontology.
I think it is a very different ontology. I was kind of reflecting while you were talking about this, because you're almost like implying there is a sense of self. Whereas I don't think that there is a sense of, not in the cultures that I am familiar with, which are the cultures of the plains and the hunter-gatherers of North America, not so much the agricultural peoples of the Southwest, whereby there's always almost like an ontological instability in the sense of in the self, because there's always this mutability, or the possibility that you can mutate, or that a spirit will actually guide you or into a different way. So there doesn't seem to be a core.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Around which you build an idea of self, or a reflection upon yourself, which is what you're describing. You know, it stems from the awareness of being alive, whereas in native North America it's very experiential and is all very changeable, immutable, and so there is no stability to this self. If you see what I mean. I don't know if it makes sense, but it is almost like an ever fluctuating sort of.
And that makes sense as well. That's how, of course, then you're going to have to get to know someone by just seeing how they behave.
Yes.
What is this self to you? Because the self could change any time. But it's a fascinating. That's a really fascinating highlighting of the idea that some cultures do and some cultures don't have a strong sense of self. Something that we assume is very basic. I do this, I go there, I want that. And I think in India, people are kind of realizing the degree to which it contained both views. So you have a whole tradition within India, in Buddhism, amongst a group called the Charvakas, who are very early atheists, and continuing within parts of Hindu culture that says there is no stable self. It's changing, it's flowing, it's moving. It's kind of the basis of Buddhist thought, the an-atman, there is no core. And then exactly, they're trying to negotiate what that means. So you shift, you change, you're shaped from moment to moment. And then you've got this other way of thinking that becomes kind of dominant within Orthodox Hindu culture, that I have an atman, a core self. Then,
It gives stability and gives almost like creates this narrative of the self, this continuity, doesn't it? Whereas I don't find that this continuity exists in native North American cultures. I know, in the sense that it is ever flowing. It in a sense is much more pre-Socratic, if you wish.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So.
But then the big issue, I mean, in India, in the cultures that accept the Atman, that becomes the core of so much, a core exactly of identity, and also a core of your life story. What are you going to do with your life? You're going to seek the Atman. What are you going to do across your lives through history, life after death, after rebirth? I'm going to guide my Atman, myself, on a journey towards the heights, right, through the levels of the cosmos, as it were, towards the heavens and beyond. And that journey varies in different traditions, but it gives a kind of a tale to the Indian person that transcends the immediate goals. How does that work out in a tradition that doesn't have that?
Well, I was just thinking that because as we were talking about visions at the early, in the early part of this conversation, one of the founding moments of a person's life in Plains Indian tradition is when the person seeks a vision in order to find a helper. a spiritual helper, which is what in shamanic traditions is usually called, the shamanic helper. This is the animal, the thing, the plant, the piece of wood or stone that will follow you throughout your life. This is something that will instruct you, that will give you a way to live.
Interesting.
Yeah. So this is perhaps the closest thing we can see to a core, but that too can change, because the kind of spiritual power that you get from this visitation, this vision, this mystical encounter with a supernatural being or an intangible being, or what in anthropology we call other than human person, is talked about in terms of power, spiritual power. But this spiritual power is something really quite difficult to describe, because it's something that is at the crossroad between an ever-flowing energy that keeps the cosmos alive, but also a personal protection. So it is both a moral concept as well as a sense of a cosmological concept.
Interesting.
Simultaneously.
I think that's what I was thinking. Okay, actually, then I want to know. There are many cultures that will have exactly a world from which energies and powers come, and you see this in, let's say, the Yoga Sutras, where they talk about you do your yoga, you heighten your inner hidden body, and it will give you powers to achieve enlightenment or to get some magical abilities. Basically, what sounds like a sort of a classic array of shamanic abilities are outlined in the third book of the Yoga Sutra: flying, being invisible, taking the forms of other beings, passing through matter, etc. All of these kind of classic tropes. But the text kind of makes it clear these are magical things you can do to transcend the natural. But the real important thing is to figure out what your bigger goal is. And someone who just uses them for personal benefit, well, it's not that they're bad and they're going to go to hell, but they're missing the bigger point. So then you have, in addition to the supernatural possibilities, the issue of a moral, or in some deeper level, a source of meaningful guidance and goals. And that comes through these helpers.
Certainly, and what you're describing as the core shamanic sort of concepts or tropes, as you call them, are very much part of that kit that could be given to a person. It could be the gift of hindsight, or invisibility, or being powerful in battle, or any number of things. And obviously there are people that put that to work towards bad means, and some others that will use them as a protection, as a medicine, they would call. And the reason I brought in the cosmological and the moral points together is because this notion of medicine in native North America is simultaneously a religious concept as well as a concept for health and well-being, is a moral principle as well as a health principle. So there are concepts in Native American languages like the Bimadisiwin in Algonquin, which is or Hojong in Navajo, which are concepts that are very difficult to translate in English, and because they simultaneously bring together these registers, and so inherently something that is beautiful is also good for you, but it is also morally acceptable. So good morality goes along with good health and well-being, as well as being a moral principle that is reflected in religious and cosmological spheres. That is, the balance within yourself, and the balance between yourself and society, and the balance between yourself and the other beings, the other than human. So all these elements are coming together in these concepts.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, that's something I think that you also get if you do an anthropology of different concepts of the good, of morality, of what is of value. I think you often see that the West, when it takes a big knife and it chops up moral goodness from, let's say, aesthetic goodness, it feels good, it tastes good, it looks beautiful, it makes me happy, it has value, from the right thing. And it often puts them in tension. Suddenly you've got the idea that your passions are going to draw you towards the pleasurable, but you need to push away towards the good. Right? Is a complicated kind of dichotomy that is, I don't say given the lie, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it's challenged by looking at cultures that have these concepts of goodness which unite all of that to a large extent. And you see this in many cases. I think of it in Plato, just as an example, where Plato's good, his concept of the good in the Republic relates to the state. In the Phaedo, it relates to the body and the person. In the Symposium, it relates to the cosmos and human relations. It unites those things. And the Indian case, I guess, is the hardest Indian word to translate, dharma. So central, but almost impossible to do with some idea of a moral order, a harmony, a balance, as you say, that both makes things good and functioning, and at the same time tells you how you should behave. So this rich composite concept of goodness, I think.
I was wondering while you were talking about, just because I've been incredibly fascinated by all this, and also because it was a window into my, as a way of reflecting into my field I was wondering what function then you think Indian art or high art may have in conveying some of these ideas. Because the whole notion of beauty, I don't know whether that wraps in as well this notion of moral good, or whether or not the statues that you look at or that you are being looked at or looked by convey this notion, or how the two concepts seem to.
That's
I don't know if you have
question.
ever.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and it makes me think. Okay, so much Indian art is concerned with what it means to with bringing other realities into being.
Yeah.
So it's really embodying, incarnating another reality. It's making the reality be right here, and that's interesting. But then your question makes me think also. So when is Indian art portraying something which is seen as a good, as an ideal? When is it bringing beauty or goodness rather than depicting, embodying, etc., or just symbolizing? And that's a hard one. I don't know. There are very, if you look at the ancient shastras, things like the Shilpa Shastra, which tells you how to make statues, and it gives you very detailed accounts of measurements, exactly what the body and how the eyes should be made, and what the beautiful accounts of how the curve of the torso in a classic Indian statue. You see this when you go to the British Museum, how that should work, and it creates a wonderful style, and clearly it's rooted in some sense of grace. I always think Indian aesthetic contexts are fascinating because they like curves. They quite like complexity. It's very sensuous. Yeah, and often complexity. If you read Indian poetry in connection with the visual material, you see they're incredibly complex poems. Just the structure of Sanskrit means that, kind of as in German, you can have lots of word compounds put together. So the creeper covered in lotuses will not just be a creeper covered in lotuses, it will be a lake blue creeper, jasmine smelling creeper, blah 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 creeper, and the creeper is suddenly so rich. So in the art you see density of beauty in many ways, and an interest in grace and complexity, not the simple lines. But does that express the good? Oh, I don't know. That expresses people's taste. I mean, one thing, it makes me think that actually to find an expression of dharma, you go to the more geometric, patterned and ordered forms of art, like mandalas, which express a complete cosmos.
Yes.
That's maybe how you say that kind of thing.
Yes. In fact, I was at the very beginning of my studies of Indian art, I was very much fascinated by the whole notion of aniconism, the absence of an icon, and still being able to convey multiplicity of meanings simultaneously. And so the the mandalas or Sri Yandra and all these ideas that that hint or index an idea but do not represent it, for me, were very crucial in thinking all my material, precisely because very often, going back to the idea of what is real, the conjuring up of other realities is, in my opinion, filtered through the geometry and not through the representational. It is precisely in these instances that you almost transcend, and is the closest you can get to depicting or giving form to something that is very difficult to describe.
Yeah, absolutely. But I find this fascinating because India has a strong sense of both the divine as an abstract reality, what's called nirguna, no qualities. Brahman, who is infinite, without form, etc., etc. And then there are issues about how to represent that. There's a beautiful image, I think in the Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C., or it was there for a while, of a yogi who has achieved moksha, liberation, realized his true nature as Brahman, and has a picture of him before liberation, looking like a person, and then a picture of him after liberation as Brahman, and he's just not there. There's just an empty space. So they're trying to, get across transcendence, and it's fascinating. And as you say, the lingam, of course, is the classic.
It's the classic.
Yeah, the abstract. And I love the story of how the lingam was created, that Shiva, you get these texts called the Puranas devoted to different gods, and each one says its god is the main and most important one. And so in a Purana devoted to Shiva, Shiva says, I'm the greatest god, and his two co-gods, Brahma and Vishnu, say, no, we are. And they have a little bit of a debate about this. And finally Shiva says, I'll manifest, I'm not this physical form here.
Yes.
I'm actually an abstract divine reality.
Yes.
And they go, oh, really?
Tell me how.
Yeah, show me. We have lots of cases in Indian text where someone says, show me your divine reality. And they do, and you get to see it. And in this, of course, Shiva manifests his true reality as an infinitely long column of, I think, light that stretches all the way infinitely into the heavens and infinitely into the depths of reality.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the gods try and find the end to prove he's finite, but they can't, right? And so that when you see in the temple this small column, it means the range of things, but one of the things it's trying to do is represent that reality.
In a sense, bringing God into this reality, or the transcendent into this reality, requires adopting a visual idiom that is closer to what people see. So the manifestation of the divine has to take a human form, otherwise our very limited mind doesn't seem to grasp it so easily. I was always fascinated by this particular form of Shivalinga, which is part linga and part Shiva himself. So almost like Shiva emerging from the linga, which is that moment of revelation, of manifestation into this reality. Is not quite as abstract as a linga, is not quite as formed as a fully body or the dancing god or the beautiful beggar or whoever it is. So the whole notion that the transcendent can very often be understood or grasped by either deep meditation or it needs to incarnate in something in order to be graspable, to be comprehensible, understandable, intelligible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an interesting move in Indian history where in the early phases of yoga and of Vedantic exploration of the notion of an abstract divinity that underlies everything, you have a few specialists, probably usually Brahmins, who would become yogis and who would adopt various methods to realize this other reality. Some saw it as something you could experience, some didn't even think you could do that, but they were trying to get to it. But of course, very few, the text seemed to acknowledge that very few people are going to manage to really take the time for this, have the mental acuity and focus to devote themselves to such a subtle, difficult to grasp kind of a thing. And so you then get that move with the kind of spread and popularization of that into material culture, and suddenly you get all these images coming out.
A proliferation of images.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think
One is
there's no place like India
for images.
for images.
But it's often, I think, a confusion I have. It was true of me when I first went to India, and true my students will often say to me, this was a really odd experience. When you come to India having studied, for instance, philosophy, or yoga, and have engaged with concepts of this other divine reality, transcendent reality, which are quite abstract, and you get to India and you're like,
where is it?
Where is it? Like, but we've got everything else. We've got this. We've got Ganesha, the elephant, and we've got Lakshmi sitting there pouring. We've got every image possible, right? So, and I always think that the image that really expresses that is in the Bhagavad Gita. There's something called the Vishwarupa, when God takes on the all form, i.e. the form of the divine as everything. And Vishnu says, let me show you my divine reality. And instead of this long abstract column that Shiva becomes, Vishnu takes on Krishna as Vishnu. They're related. Krishna's the avatar, of course. He takes on this form in which he says, look, you can see every being in existence, past and future, within me. Look, I am all of the gods. Look, I'm worlds, I am time, I am everything. And this is the other way. You can go for the abstract, or you can go for so many forms that you're showing everything.
Yes. And again, drawing on the parallels that we were making between the two contexts, I think it is really interesting to me to reflect upon the variety of ways in which Native Americans of the Plains express these concepts, and the very abstract ones seems to be rarer, much more rare than the ones that are more clearly anthropomorphic, that is, that have human form. And in a sense, perhaps it almost echoes what you're saying. Only precious few can actually have that finesse, or the capacity, or the ability to reach that the abstraction of such concepts and realities that are unseen, intangible, and the other ones that need probably to express things in an intelligible way will express it by means of showing faces, just as sketched, just to manifest this idea that the beings that exist in another register are other persons, essentially.
Yeah. I know what you mean. And it becomes, there's a nice bit in the Chandogya Upanishad where it says the word is a handle. It's a handle that you put onto the reality to carry it around and use it. But it's also a reminder that words or any image is only a handle. It's not the whole picture in some sense. I always think this is important. Of course, India suffered greatly when, with the advent of colonialism, first Islamic rulers and then British rulers, of course, come in, and neither have the conceptual the necessary conceptual toolkit to understand what they're seeing when they see images of the gods. These murtis, to them, are idols. They're worshipping mere matter. And they don't understand what it means to look through the matter to the reality that's behind it. But I always think that's fascinating, then, that the eyes, when you create a murti and you turn it into a vehicle for the divine, it's the painting of the eyes onto the statue. And the ritual moment where you show the statue a mirror so it can look into its own eyes and see itself inside the statue, right? In the same way, I think that when I look in the mirror, I think, oh God, there's my face, what a pain, I'm stuck with that. Oh, but then you look in the eyes, that's me. That's the real me hidden inside this contingent body. So it's still that question of learning what you need to understand in order to see past that visual thing is interesting. I have a question I want to ask you.
Yes.
So I'm really fascinated in the forms that the other world, and here I'm thinking more specifically of the reality that exists a little bit like this world, but of its own supernatural kind. So I'm not really talking about the transcendent divine. I'm talking about spirit worlds, animist worlds, etc., dream worlds. I want to know what it's like in Native American traditions. I had a very happy experience once in Thailand, which is much influenced by Hinduism, of course, where I was in a little town called Phang Nga in the south, and they have a temple, a cave temple called the Heaven and Hell Temple. I didn't know it was there, and I looked into the trees just off the road, and I saw some life-size demons walking through the grass, and actually they were strangling people, as demons do, obviously. And I thought, my God, that's really, but are they real? No, they're and then I realized behind the demons was a tree full of demonic birds, life-size tree, and then I realized there was a giant dragon just behind going into the cave, and I thought, wow, life in reality just got much more exciting. And this was a cave, it's very common in Thailand, where you go into this temple arena, they've created the other world in physical, life-size, realistic images. You can walk through the dragon's mouth and meet the demons and look through their teeth and meet the gods as well, which was interesting. That gave me a picture of, in that culture, how they show you what the other world is like. What's the other world like?
The other world manifests itself in bits and pieces. And it manifests itself through human form or through a personal form. Very often is the other human beings manifest themselves in forms that humans can understand. So they will take the form of a deer, they'll take a form of but they are deer persons, they are bear persons, they are beaver persons, they are buffalo persons, they're eagle persons, they're coyote persons. Now, I have never come across any narrative, written or otherwise, by Native Americans that describe what this other world is like.
Interesting.
I don't think there is a homogeneous shared view as to, not even within one group of, a speech community, let's put it that way. But it can be describable by means of vision. And this happens very often, what I found, after the arrival of Europeans. The visions are much more literally realistic, in the sense that with vivid colors and, adopting that idiom that we are familiar with, that we call realism or naturalism, rather. Not that before that doesn't happen, because the visions are clearly depicted in a naturalistic or a style on shields, on clothing, on teepees, on any surfaces. But the other reality, what does it look like? I think it takes you experientially to get through and see it through the eyes of your helper.
Yeah, interesting.
Or through what the helper will give you, the vision that your helper will give you.
That's something that's interesting about that to me is that it means I can't go, I wonder what reality is like. Look, can someone show me a picture? Oh, that's what it is. Now I know. Oh, how interesting. I can't have that abstract, disinterested knowledge of it. I have to go. And that's, I think, also maybe important in a tradition, that if there's a reality that you're not supposed to treat as merely a passing collection of information, but as something that you meet, then not only maybe you can't portray it visually, but also it's better not to, actually.
I think that there is a degree of humility in this, is not wanting to, to suggest that it may be like this. Only individual persons can have access, and what they are granted is that moment of vision, or several visions, but those instances in which these encounters sort of open up a window into the other reality, and then when the vision's closed, it's closed. But people don't have a clear sense of what it is, and probably they don't want to do it, don't want to depict it, because maybe it would be too much to do, or too pretentious.
Yeah, I think that's right. In some ways, it makes me feel that the scopophiliac, the vision-oriented way of looking at the world, is misleading. I look at you, I look at the building, I think I've got it, I've covered it, I know it, but I don't know it, in fact. And it keeps reality alive. If you don't try and put a cover around it and put it in your pocket and walk away, I've got the visual knowledge, leave that open. And actually maybe that's a sensitizing function of the art. It leaves you open to the real.
Certainly Native Americans have a very open-ended view of what the connection between the tangible and the intangible is or can be. They leave it open-ended, they don't know. It's not possible for a human to know. You just wait for signs to come to you, so that you're graced by the transcendent, in a sense. One thing that I wanted to say was there is a shared moral sort of stance in many Native American cultures, which is that of pity. Humans are pitiful. They need help by other spirits, by other beings, by other persons in the intangible reality. And so recognizing humans, or acknowledging that humans are pitiful beings that are weak and powerless, and they need any help they can get, is perhaps a reflection of what we are saying, is the fact that you can't be so big-headed to think that you can really grasp or even attempt to give full vision, or because vision
it's not that impressive, actually.
It's not, It is the experience, and the experience is the vision.
It's the real thing, it's fascinating.